So our first presenter today is Mr. TonyMassaro, who is partner, Integrated Infrastructure, Real Estate Advisory, PwC Australia. Tony brings over 20 years of experience leading and advising both public and private sector organisations on property projects across diverse industry sectors, including retirement, aged care, residential, commercial office and industrial. Through his varied role as both principal with the likes of Stockland and ING Real Estate, as well as his current role at PwC, Tony has significant experience in both running property businesses and advising clients on property matters. His education includes an undergraduate degree from Bucknell University in the United States and an MBA with distinction from Harvard Business Schools. Please welcome Tony.
All right. Thanks for that, Rob. So, you know, lovely to be here in Melbourne today. I've met some of you before. I worked with Pete 16 years ago at Rothschild. That's fascinating to me, that ESG thing, right? So what ESG stands for is environmental, social, and governance matters, right? So think about the environmental, you think about things like carbon and carbon neutral and pollution and things of that nature. You think about your social, your societal, so how are we doing on diversity, inclusion, et cetera. And then governance, like how organizations, you know, are they being run in a way that makes sense within the rules and whatnot. You guys are people who are superstars running your businesses, and you spend less time pontificating about what's right, what's wrong than some of these ASX 200 corporations, right? In the ASX 200 and 300 corporation, and actually globally, ESG is the single highest thing that CEOs are focused on this year. So PwC does a global CEO survey, and ESG is what it's about. Partially driven by everyone. A lot of people look at ESG and they just think environmental, because that is the E, and they go, it's just about sustainability, but that's really rocketed up on account of carbon, right? So we've signed to go carbon neutral by 2050. That is a massive challenge, despite some of the good Kool-Aid that you'll hear. Anyway, interestingly enough, buildings and property represent about 40% of carbon emissions in the world. So it's a massive thing in my world amongst building owners and property people as well. So maybe that's a good segue. I'm here to talk to you guys today about property. Now, the cool thing about property is that it touches every single business that you have out there. I don't care if you're in professional services, if you're in banking, if you are brewing beer, whatever you do, you touch property somehow, even if you're just working out of your home, because that's the piece of property you're working out of, right? You'll either be renting an office, or you'll have a warehouse, or you'll have people working in different places, or your own warehouses, or whatever. So property is ubiquitous, and probably everybody is either renting or living in a house. So property touches everyone, was one of the reasons why I like it. Happy to talk about it. I will talk about, so today I'm going to go through some macro themes on where that's at, and then just talk about some of the different property asset classes, which would be probably useful for you guys. But bottom line is, I'm a kind of an ad-libber, so if you want me to talk about something different, raise your hand, ask me to. We can go down tangents, we can go down rabbit holes. I don't know. But when you think about property, the way your brain can get your head around it, instead of being one big word, is thinking about different asset classes, right? So some of the major asset classes will be obvious to you. Residential is one, right? We all live somewhere, whether that's in a house that we rent or own, or in jail, wherever it is. They're all residential properties, right? You've got office. So office properties, where we are now, you guys might have offices, whatever. You got industrial. Think about warehouses, right? You got retail, shopping malls, things like that. Those are really the big ones, but there's a lot more asset classes, right? Retirement living, totally separate from aged care, two distinct asset classes. Hotels, student housing, build to rent, right? So there's a lot of different types of asset classes, and what I'll do is I'll just touch on some of the big ones here today. And again, if you're happy for it, Rob, I'm happy for questions along the way.
Yeah, whatever.
And if you're like actually really specific questions, like, hey, I got a warehouse with, what is that? What's happening in that? Yeah, really happy to go there. All right. So let us start just kind of at where we at. What are we seeing? Okay. So right now, slower deal activity. Everyone's aware, obviously, we're in Melbourne. We're coming out of COVID, right? Things are getting started again. What has that meant for the property industry? Fewer deals are being done, as in assets being bought and sold. Partially driven by interest rates, right? Interest rates have been going up. They're sitting at 2.85 is BBSY right now, and that's incredibly different. Now, Pete will sit there, and he and I can remember back in the days where it was much, much higher, and I'm sure all of you in this room can as well, but we're just coming off of years of extraordinarily low interest rates. Interest rates are fundamental to property, right? So the bottom line, when you buy a property, and think about this when you bought your houses, if you own a house, you put some equity in, but you borrowed a bunch from the bank as well, right? And so the interest rate is, and at a commercial scale, people do the same things. They buy a $500 million office tower, they're gonna put at least 50% equity in it, usually, right? 50% debt. So all of a sudden, they got $250 million of debt out there. When that interest rate goes from bugger all nothing to 2.85, and that's the bank bill rate, that's the reserve bank rate, right? The bankers then add theirs on top of that. It is material for some people. And if they're over-leveraged, it's disastrous, right? Welcome to, back in 1991, which happened here too. So higher interest rates, low unemployment. That's an interesting one, right? Because of COVID, our doors were locked as a country. Not that many people came in. If you want a job right now, you can have it. Some people have actually dropped out of the employment market altogether for whatever, there actually has been an uptake of social welfare as well, but it actually impacts what's happening on the property side of the house as well. And then supply chain disruption, right? So not only getting your goods, okay, and that's going to affect things like industrial properties, but getting materials to build property is of utmost importance to those in the industry that are saying, well, hey, I'm going to build this, right? So just as an example, it used to take about 6 weeks in a manufactured home estate to build a property. Now it's kind of like 5 months. And that is purely because the supply chain's gumming that up. So all of these things kind of happening equate to uncertainty in the market. Now, I like volatility. I like uncertainty because one of the great things about property as an asset class is information and circumstances are asymmetric. So it's like, a rising tide, all boats don't rise. Some still sunk. And that creates opportunities. And so for the right property in the right place, you can actually find deals and you can do well out of property in any point of the cycle. In one right now where we have a fair bit of volatility, you can actually do really well. So again, that's kind of setting out where the macro kind of property market is. If we look at some of the things, particularly to Australia, right? We have strong economic fundamentals. The interesting thing is, yes, interest rates have been rising. Why? Because inflation was going hard. Because COVID had put a crimp on the ability to spend. You couldn't go out even if you wanted to, right? Couldn't buy stuff. Well, you could buy some stuff. And so inflation came along. So this is very different than like the crisis in GFC and whatnot, right? There was nothing fundamentally wrong with our economy. And so it is still quite strong. Australia has a AAA rating, so that actually gives a lot of confidence to international investors as well. Say, all right, this is a place that's going well. We handled the crisis pretty well, so they're happy to come in here. Deal activity. So when you think about what has happened, given the interest rates have gone up, given we're coming out of COVID, there's uncertainty, people tend to stop. They assess the situation more so than they would if they're like, yeah, I'm in the middle of doing stuff. So sales, as I said before, deal activity has slowed down. And interestingly enough, that fundamental relationship between interest rates and price of buildings, i.e. when you do a lot of debt and your buildings then have higher costs associated with them, they're worth less. Right? It's just that's how buildings are valued. It comes down to your earnings before interest and earnings after tax, and you cap that up, right? So your net income, you cap that up, and you say that's what a building's worth. When your income goes down, building is worth less. So people all of a sudden are out there saying, oh, my building might be worth less. Maybe I don't want to sell it. And what happens then is valuers, so official people say this is what a building is worth, are unable to actually capture the reality in the market, right? So valuers use a methodology including looking at similar transactions, right? So a valuer will go, well, there's no transactional evidence in the market that says to me that an office tower that's worth 100 million beforehand should now be worth 90. Even though we can look at the empirical evidence and say, the margin is less, it's worth less. The reality is the valuers won't move, and so they tend to lag when buildings are going down in value, which I feel for valuers, right? They lag at both sides. When buildings are going up in value, when the world is great, and you have a building, you're like, I'm gonna sell it, and it's worth about 100 mil, because that's what ones around that have been selling for a while, and you go, oh, actually, but I feel really strong, I'm gonna pay 110 for it. The valuer said it was worth 100. And then you say, thanks guys, I got 110 for it. The valuers look bad. I feel for them. They have to abide by transactional evidence. So in a rising market and in a falling market, they're usually lagging. So as it slows down, the market enters a price discovery phase, which is a fancy words to say people are unsure. They're kind of doing the dance to figure out what that price might be. Opportunity. So one of the things, I talked to you about those big asset classes, right? Retail, office, industrial, they tend to be the big three. A lot of international and kind of corporate investors buy those types of buildings. Well, when competition gets really tough in those particular asset classes, people start to move up the risk curve into different asset classes, riskier asset classes that have operating businesses associated with them, things like student housing, seniors housing. So while some of those larger asset classes are in a place where they're a little bit stagnant, you're not finding lots of transactions, some of the other areas are interesting, right? And so if you look at seniors, right? Seniors housing in Australia is an asset class that is characterized by people being over the age of 75. 75 is the average entry age into that. Well, when you correlate that with the demographic wave that is fact, and we are in year 2 of a 9-year super cycle of people turning the age of 75, and you throw the assumption that, well, if we're just going to keep the same level of penetration, right now that's around 5%, 5 of every 100 people who are 75 years old live in a retirement village, that's pretty compelling to say, this industry can't build them fast enough to house these guys. So you're getting a lot of asset class activity in different asset classes. You'll see some big transactions that are floating around the market right now in that space. So opportunities around multiple asset classes. Liquidity. So as always happens in times of a wee bit of an uncertainty is banks, I'm looking at you, Pete, because you and I worked on together, tend to go, oh, hang on a second, maybe we don't want so much out there. When you have interest rate movement like you do, REITs and superannuation funds who have allocations to buying property go, ooh, hang on a second, my numbers are a little bit out of whack here. I can't buy as much right now. So you see a lot of the REIT equity prices right now are subdued. They're down 20, 30%, some of the large REITs. They can't buy. They want to because they see some of these opportunities, but it's diluted to their shareholders, so they naturally have to pull back. However, you have other pools of capital that are very interested and still active, right? So counter-cyclical moves tend to be, they require you to be bold, but they usually require, or they usually can result in outsized profits. So you're finding a lot of private wealth, international. Now international, the other aspect that you have to look at is what's the Aussie dollar doing in the context of the world, right? So Aussie dollar right now, today is 66.9%, 60.67, 67 cents to the dollar on the US, right? Since I've lived in Australia, that has been as low as 49 cents to the dollar and as high as $1.10. Right now, 67 is pretty cheap. So there's a lot of international capital right now that is also in the face of global events. Europe's looking a little, don't know if I want to be buying warehouses in Poland, particularly when some missiles fell there today, all right? And so they say, oh, but the Aussie dollar. Australia, triple, A credit rating, interesting as a country. Not much going on, but my dollar goes further there now, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, it was a different interest rate. So That's keeping some liquidity here, coupled with some of the pools of private wealth that are doing debt as well. So you hear the term non-bank lenders, right? And you'll get debt that's going in and doing property deals. So liquidity is there, although some traditional pools have pulled back, other pools have said, all right, let's go look at it. And those pools tend to be able to look at more deals because there's fewer people out there looking at those deals. Uplift opportunities, again, across multiple sectors, right? Kind of the aftermath of what's happening and some of the cultural shifts. We'll get into this when we talk about the office sector. Some of the cultural shifts, like what does this mean, right? There are opportunities for companies that, played down a certain path for a while, and COVID opened up a whole massive market for them. Think about non-touch door opening, right? That's been around for a while. I don't know about you guys, but in all the buildings that I go into, all of a sudden, magically through COVID, you don't have to push buttons anymore. It's really, in the top end of the town buildings, everyone comes in there, oh, I got to retrofit it. I don't want people, we don't want to be touching buttons, right? And that was just a little business that now they say, oh, I've capitalized on this. You think about training, resilience, right? People going through COVID, it's a different world today than it was 3 years ago. And there's a lot more challenges and mental health issues and things like that. So all these things come into play and make for opportunities to improve buildings. So uplift opportunities. So when you're talking about adding value from a property sense, it's one of the classic ways that you're going to deliver value to your shareholders, as opposed to just buying a building, hopefully getting good rents or whatever, or waiting for the market to improve. And then rents. So rents across asset classes, and this might be apropos to some of you guys if you're renting warehouses or renting your office space or whatever, they have grown significantly depending on the asset class. And in some asset classes, they will still probably grow, partially because a lot of fund managers who realize that the cap rates are no longer going to be compressing in the asset classes where they are. Industrial is a classic example. Industrial used to have 7% cap rates, and they squeezed down to the 3s over the last few years because everyone said, hey, in COVID, all right, we're all at home, but we can still buy stuff. We need e-commerce, boom, so you need lots of warehouses. And industrial's going, now that interest rates are at 2.85, right? And your yield was 3%. You paid 3% on a yield. So that's BBSY. A bank is going to put something on top of that. There's no room there, right, to be making any profit. So they're all banking on growing their rents, right? And so growing their rents then comes back down to that number I was telling you before, right, where the income that you have in place that you're capping up. Well, it doesn't matter the cap rates maybe even got a little softer. My rents are more, so my building's still worth more, right? So it's an interesting game of balancing, and property, as I said, asymmetric information and circumstances, so there's always opportunities and lots of fun stuff happening in there. Anything on that slide? Question? Yeah?
This is a really sort of possible succinct summary. What the government fiscal policy at the moment of using interest rates to control inflation.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, honestly, what it is, so inflation is where there is a lot of money in the system and people are choosing to spend it. So there's a limited supply of goods, and you're like, well, I'll pay more for it. Look at airfares, right? Airfares are rocketing up because people are like, oh, people want to travel. And so Qantas is going, well, I only have so many seats. Cool, I can jack them up. They're still paying, they're still paying, they're still paying. So what the government is trying to do is raise interest rates, right? So that, in one sense, hits consumers, right? Your mortgages, particularly in this is a land of variable rate mortgages, right? In the US, it's a different story because it's mostly 30-year fixed rate mortgages. And you can refinance when rates go down and you're protected when they go up for no penalty. It's totally different, right? So people don't stress over interest rates rising in the US the way they do here in Australia. But that's going to hit a lot of people because the most you can fix is like 5 years, right? Even though we have a 10-year bond, you don't find too many places that let you do that. So all of a sudden, when you're starting to have to pay more on your mortgage, you're going to have less disposable income. You go, you know what, I'm not going to take that trip to Melbourne. I'm not going to eat out at that big restaurant. It cools it down. So that's consumer, which is a lot of spending. Also, from a business perspective, it cools the amount of borrowings, right? So it's cooled this market, right, in that just for deals. And so it is an interesting balance. You never want to kill an economy, right? But what you want to do is say, you want to have that nice, steady 3% growth, 2.5 to 3.5 is where most people are comfortable. And so it's a delicate balancing game with levers that aren't, impervious to other aspects that can affect them. But that's kind of where they're going right now. I'm not a macroeconomist. I've studied it, but I'm not sure if that's helpful, at least along the way.
What I'm curious, I've never quite been able to understand is if you lift the cost of doing business up by lifting interest rates up, invariably that puts prices up, which then contributes to inflation.
Yeah.
And that's the bit I don't get.
But it stifles business as well. It actually literally stifles it. So for example, a building, right? Less buildings are going to be being built, which means there's going to be builders are not in such hot demand. So then they want to keep their people employed. So they'll say, oh, I'll do it for a little cheaper. I just want the work.
I think also, Tony, at the sort of consumer level, if the punter's paying more on the mortgage, then they're spending less in the broader economy.
Correct.
I think the problem with aggressive monetary policy is it's a lagging mechanism. Like it's a blunt instrument, it's a lagging mechanism.
Yeah.
So I think the challenge at the moment for the RBA is when rates were effectively zero last year, there was really, really cheap sort of 2 and 3 year money in residential mortgages that have been middle of last year. And a heap of people, like the vast majority, were fixing sort of 2 and 3 year rate mortgages.
Yeah.
So all these increases in the last 6 months
Haven't worried them.
hasn't flushed through yet. The pain's going to start to be felt middle of next year when they start refinancing.
That's right.
And the 12 months that run after that. So, they're saying, that's why I find the public commentary around jacking up interest rates to quell inflation. Well, you're only getting the variable rate loans and you only get people who are entering the market now. And yes,
That's right.
An impact, but there's
An outsized
hundreds
impact.
of billions of fixed rate loans out there. Which
That's
haven't
right.
been touched yet.
Because the amount of loans that were fixed in the last couple of years far exceeded what has ever historically happened in Australia. Again, nothing like the US, but, and most people did fix that 2-3 year, right? Because they thought, oh, that's different. And even then, they weren't fixing the whole amount, right? So, yeah, no, it's very interesting.
Can you comment on where you see retail shops and they jack the rental up quite significantly, they lose their tenants,
Yep.
but they don't seem to be concerned about replacing those tenants?
It's insane, isn't it? Right?
Benefit or discount or?
It's interesting. So we'll go into retail a little bit later, but I look at that and I say fundamentally, it's a crazy prospect. Some landlords do it.
Is there a tax benefit that they're?
No, I mean, so let's go post-COVID, right? So the COVID, let's set all that aside. There's not a tax benefit to having an empty shop, right? You're hoping that you can get somebody else coming in there on a better or a good deal, right? And now, actually, another fascinating thing that's going to flush through the property market is the changing IFRS rules in how you account for leases, right? So it used to be that you valued a tenant by how much they pay and how long they stay with you. So longer tenant, I'm going to give a premium to that, right? I own an industrial shed. If I can get a tenant that's paid for 30 years, I love it. Set and forget, because I also do have like CPI clauses in there. My rent's going to go up every year. I'm loving it as an institutional investor. Now, that tenant is going to have to declare on their finances that lease requirement over the period of that, and it goes on their balance sheet. It is going to blow bank ratios out, right? And no change to the business. It's just simply being a particular way that it's recorded on the balance sheet to a new way that it's recorded on the balance sheet. And the big question is this going to affect property values? Because now everyone's going to want to do, I'll do, instead of a 5 + 5 + 3, I'm going to do a 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. So I only really have to put on my balance sheet that 1 year exposure. And then me as a landlord, I'm like, oh, I want you to be sticky. I don't want to have to renegotiate with you every year, right? So that's interesting. But to your point of, it does nobody any good to drive a tenant out. if that tenant is a good tenant. At the same time, if you figure you can, so what I've seen it happen is landlords say, I think I can get another tenant. Again, back to my comment, asymmetric. Some landlords are lovely. Some landlords are human and they're people. And they're like, hey, you know, you've been good to me. I've been good to you. You know, you know, I want to see your business thrive. I'm making good money on this. Cool, right? Other ones are institutions, right? They're corporations, so they actually aren't people, although they're treated like a body corporate, right? Corporal, let's get into our Latin, right? And they're like all about, well, these rents, I want increases, someone can pay more. It's all about generating the profits, indifferent to the business. And when you're talking about retail, I'm thinking you're talking about smaller high street kind of, you know, premises of that nature, where it is, you know, it can be ruthless. You also sometimes have, so I'll give you an example of where a corporation will want that tenant to ultimately leave, and it's where there's larger things afoot from a development perspective, right? So I'm buying 6 shops in a row, and it just happens to be a Woolworths down there because they're going to expand and put something else there. So you will drive tenants out that you prefer ultimately to leave, jack up rents however you need to get rid of them, because that hits my development milestone. And if I had them in a 5-year lease, I then have to break costs to them. Whereas if I can manage that, so there's an entire game, because it is a game. Property as a whole is a game. I love it. I love to play games. I love property, right? There's an entire game on the development side of the house in timing it right? So I'm involved in buying a lot of the properties for Sydney Metro. All the Metro that's going around. You guys are going to have it here soon, the SRL, right? Suburban Rail Loop. Sydney Metro bought a bunch of properties in all over, you know, Sydney, including smaller ones and retail and whatnot. And you know, and we go in there and negotiate with those guys, even though it is compulsory acquisition. We try and do them all, and we get about 96% of them without having to go to compulsory acquisition. And part of the stick that we go is, hey, this is going to become a metro station in 18 months. You can stay here. Fine, you stay here, rent free. Like when we're talking about the price and the negotiation and all that, because that makes for an easy timing of, we know the tenant's gone when we need it to develop. So that could be a reason, like, you know, just depending, there's a lot of different reasons why it's there, but there's not a tax benefit to having a empty shop. You know, you don't get that negative gearing that you do on your house. But again, I'm not a tax guy. I'm a property guy in a big organization that does tax and accounting. So I will get into that. So let me get into the actual individual slides. But the answer is, Australia is a market of micro markets. Okay, so Australia is a country. What's happening in Melbourne office CBD is not the same thing that's happening in Sydney CBD. Is not the same thing in Perth CBD. And we'll get into that a little bit forward. But because there's a whole story around office as well. And I know that I can talk forever. So, but that's all right. Because yeah. No, but any other questions on that one before we delve down? No. All right. So I touched upon a few of these things, right? GDP, growth of gross domestic product, 3.7%. Unemployment rate was 3.5% in August 2002. It's about 1% now, right? It is so low. Population growth, not a lot. Now we have opened the floodgates to 195,000 per year new immigrants, which is a good thing. Hopefully that will get back up and we'll have people working where we, you know, in our shops. CPI, right? That consumer price index, inflation, that's where it hits, right? 7%. That's the highest it's been for many, many decades. And that is where you're feeling it going in your hip pocket and saying, hey, this used to cost me that. Oh, now it's different. I'll tell you an interesting thing. I just got back from New York about 3 weeks ago. And I have a favorite steakhouse. I used to spend a lot of time in New York when I ran a bunch of properties there at one point. And my favorite steakhouse has been around since about 1880. Went in there, and as is typical of what in my mind, particularly having lived outside the US for 20 years, you always think of the US, these massive portions, and you get the sides, and you're like, you never finish them, whatever. I went back to Keen's, by the way. I don't own shares in them. If you ever get to New York, Keen's Steakhouse, best in New York. And the side dishes were the perfect size. You finished every skerrick of it. And you weren't like saying, I'm feeling stingy, But so I would say they're about a third as big as they were when I went pre-COVID. Like literally, like the spinach, the fries, the stuff that you're getting on the side, a third as big. The right amount to eat, but fascinating to me because it's biting them. And so, you know, as a business where you say, and their prices are up a little bit, but the prices, you know, they're squeezing it. You guys are small business people. You know what it takes. You're like, oh, okay, you have a lot of levers to pull, right? That's a great lever for a steakhouse to pull, and it's better for the planet and everything. Like that's all good. You know what I mean? You know, food production and whatnot. Aussie, as I said, 0.69 today, 669 about an hour ago. I do watch that one a lot because I do stuff in between. And 10-year bond, right? 3.9%. Actually, today it's 3.6 because that 3.9 was put in before the most recent upgrades in the interest rates. So bond and interest rates work, you know, in opposite directions. Interest rates go up, bond rates go down. Again, so macro indicators, right? So then you say, what is this going to do from a macro trends perspective, right? You know, look at where were we kind of 2021 and then 22 and 23 outlook. Consumption and spending, you know, it was coming out of COVID, was kind of solid, going up. I think that these increases will stop and it will start to go down a little bit. Right? I know personally, you think twice before you're necessarily doing the same things that you did before. Infrastructure. So infrastructure is an interesting conversation that we could talk for an hour about just on that. And infrastructure is another blunt tool that governments use in several ways. But one of those ways is stimulating an economy, right? We have one of the most record infrastructure spending that's happening in Australia right now than has ever been. Like WA alone on the mining sector has like 100 billion slated, and you know, you got hundreds of million in SRL for you guys, you know, Sydney Metro, inland rail, right, coming through. So there's a lot of that that's happening, and that's continuing to go up. Again, I won't get off on an infrastructure tangent. E-commerce, it really blew out during COVID, and I think that, you know, you'll find it's hitting some steady state right now, and that's also going to affect why some of them will probably have a little bit of a blowout of cap rates in the industrial section. Global capital flows, look, it's funny how the world feels like post-COVID and in this little bit crazy geopolitical reality, there's a little bit of, oh, we're going to focus more on domestic. Like, you know, Melbourne, we took factories out of mothballs and reconverted them when we did hand sanitizer. You know, there was a couple big success stories here in Melbourne. And there's a bit of, oh, well, we don't want to rely on the Chinese for everything now, right? Like global supply chains. But global capital, on the other hand, is more global than ever. Speed of capital, given technology today, is never been faster. You're looking at alternative, you know, ways of storing capital, of Bitcoin, although you look at that kind of recent debacle over the last few days, makes you glad, well, I don't know, depending how early you went, you still might be laughing your way to the bank. But global capital flows will continue to go up. Population growth here, right? So the world has just hit 8 billion, or is just about to, which is interesting. And it only took a couple of years for that to happen. But here in Australia, fortunately, we're still, you know, in the low 20s, or mid 20s, I guess now. We like population growth to a certain extent, right? Again, balancing ability to sustain, which some estimates say, well, 40 mil is kind of what we should never get more than that here in Australia, whatever. But I mean, a lot of us alive in this room today can remember Australia at about 10, 12 mil, right? It wasn't that long ago. But we will continue to grow, albeit, you know, we're opening the floodgates a little bit to immigration, but it's not like we're totally throwing them open. And then interest rates, I think that they have gone up. I don't think we've seen the last of them. I think they will continue to go up a little bit more, although hopefully they will be tempered. Next slide, please. Back to valuers, right? So looking at property valuers' views. Again, this is a group of people that I have worked with closely for 20 years, and I have a lot of empathy for, because their job is hard, right? They have to try and say, where are these things going? And banks are relying on it, right? So credit committee, right? At the bank is saying, okay, well, what's the external val saying? And you realize that it comes down to a bit of judgment and a bit of art and science and what comps you're pulling into it. But we think about the office sector, right? So the hybrid model working. Let's be clear. Drop the mic. The old school of 5 days a week in the office, it is out of the bag. It is a shattered glass vase on the floor. I do not think that we will see, as a broad society, we're going back to that. Definitely there are some organizations, and the organizations like yours, right? I have a really good buddy who runs a smaller organization, and he's like, yeah, you know, people, even during COVID, you know, once they let us out of our houses, people said to me, oh, I want to come in 3 days a week. And I said to them, oh, okay, if you want to use your holidays, fine, go for it. If not, you're gone, right? So some people will run shops like that. But what we're seeing across the broader of society is actually it works, right? The cool thing is productivity can be maintained, if not improved, with an element of remote working. And I think Jane would be able to attest to there are mental consequences after a while of complete remote working and all these kinds of things with her resilience training that she does. But it is here to stay. So what does that mean for office, right? I don't think that the office CBD, the office tower or the CBD is dead. What it means generally is repurposing the real estate that you as a company have to now meet the requirements of the changing model, right? So at PwC, we at first, well, we had a floor that we were looking to sublet in Sydney pre-COVID. So that kind of went on, and that was fascinating to watch. So the amount of space that came on from a subletting perspective during COVID was the most ever recorded in Australia. And we didn't sublease it in the end. And all of our spaces, we actually repurposed them. We needed more small meeting rooms. Not meeting rooms for 10 people, meeting rooms for one person. Because there's a lot of people that now are doing the remote and hey, I just need to jump on this meeting. This one's not in person today, or someone of 6 people in a meeting is going to be remote, so you need to jump into a room and be able to do that. Back to what I was saying earlier about organizations that have found a bit of wind beneath their wings in uplifting it because of COVID. You have smaller organizations that go, oh, well, we can do this. We can help this with the office. Air purifiers and people counters. Another thing is more space. So the old 10 square meters, which government used to have, now would do gigs for government. And they're like, oh, give us 12, give us 13 square meters. You know, they weigh the cost impact of that. How many people do we have? But you're seeing offices used in a little bit of a different way. And the other thing is you've got to earn the commute. So if you want people to come back in, it's like, well, why should I? And so you see attempts to do it, right? Oh, free beers on Thursday nights or whatever. And if you look at occupancy right now in the city, so Melbourne is actually interesting because it lagged Sydney, but it is back. It is. You guys felt it the most here, and it is still the slowest to get back up. In Sydney right now, most days, Mondays, Fridays, relatively dead. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, pre-COVID levels in the city. For a balance of around 75% pre-COVID in the city working. Melbourne's, I think, closer to 55, 60. It is definitely lower than some of the other cities. And places like Canberra, they are the even solid dent. Why? One of the reasons is public transport. Right? Everyone drives to work in Canberra. Well, a few people take the kind of white elephant that is the tram there, but most people drive. And so for them, it's actually very easy to be back in there. What else have I always talking about? Good demand, little coming to market. So you have to have willing buyer, willing seller for transactions to happen. Valuers want to have transactions so they can have transaction evidence. Again, that no recent transaction. So reduction of yield. So we're getting on this in lots of asset classes. It's around, well, have the prices started to go down yet? I was in a room with a bunch of finance people from a Singaporean REIT last week. And they're like, oh, so what should we do, you know, with our properties? Because valuers aren't going to tell them that they're going down in value. But yet everyone can look at, yeah, interest rates rose, right? So what I said to them was, look, my recommendation to you is fact. Interest rates have gone up. Fact, your buildings are worth less. Now, you didn't have to sell them, so you don't know. But if I was disclosing to shareholders, I would actually mark my values down a little bit. Now, how much is up to you. You do the science, do the math. But I would feel hand on heart as an executive going to shareholders and saying, you know what, my properties are worth a little bit less, because they are. If you look back to GFC, what happened? Nothing sold for a while. So there was no change in property prices, particularly like in office, for 18 months, almost 24 months. And then the valuers are like, we know, like it's so obvious that we're wrong. We're refusing to write these values anymore. And they started, and very, very quickly everyone, yeah, they're all less, right? It allowed for some of the REITs to get themselves re-levered. If you remember, they were raising equity at below cost or below net asset value, right? Because that's one of the issues that they got to deal with.
Sure, that you would not miss that flight, so just
No, all good. So again, comes down to transactions and evidence. I will whip through the rest of these. Resi market. We've really basically hit the top of the resi market for the moment. As a broad market, I can point to you neighborhoods and suburbs where prices are still rising. What traditionally happened is places where they were cheaper, that cheap money allowed people to say, oh, I'm going to get in here on the property ladder, and they've driven them up. They are getting hit the hardest. If we look at Melbourne, all right, your median house price is down 6% from December 21. That was the peak here in Melbourne from median house price. Units, a little bit less, 5.7, right? Auction clearance rate went from 80% to 68%, right? So fewer people right now are getting the money and getting the loans required to go out there and buy resi. And a few more distressed. What Pete talked about, when we have this wave of 2-3 year fixed rate mortgages coming off, you will see a lot more distress in the market, and that'll drag prices down a little bit more going forward.
Other markets? So that's obviously Victoria that you're referring to.
Yeah, that was Victoria. So it is happening everywhere, right? Everywhere that same thing is happening. Interestingly enough, Adelaide, which had lagged, so markets that benefited from the big price increases of the last few years are the ones that you'll feel it the most. Sydney's almost exactly the same as Melbourne, but Sydney, Kellyville, you're feeling it a lot more than you are in Double Bay, right? And when you start to get into ultra high, when you're talking Kew, Hawthorne kind of stuff here, Mornington Peninsula stuff, people aren't worried about this. They're not affected by the rates so much, so it becomes a want and trophy, so at the very ultra high end of resi, that can sometimes, it'll go down a little bit, but it won't suffer the structural, 20% down that places out in Geelong way will.
Because Adelaide, they're still saying that there is potential growth. Is that
Absolutely. Yeah, they are. And I actually would argue you can get a deal anywhere. You can get a deal. It comes down to that. I have bought resi houses that I've owned in a market that you shouldn't be able to find value, but I did. Why? It was a couple getting divorced, and it was bitter. And they're like, sell that fucker, they're just like, and they didn't get, and I'm like, okay, I can buy that, So it just, it depends on where. But as a whole, from a market perspective, Adelaide seems to, because it didn't have the massive price rise that everywhere else did. Office, just go one more slide, please. Just go down to the next one. We've talked a bit about office, right? So if we look at the vacancy, you were asking earlier, someone was asking earlier about, rents, right? So office is funny. For those of you who don't realize office plays a game within a game, right? So they have face rent, so net face rent. So I'm going to charge you $100. And then they have incentives, which means I'm going to reduce it. I'm going to give you 20% incentives. But my net face rent is $100, but I'm paying you 80. Why don't you just call it 80 bucks that I pay you, right? It's just a weird thing in office, right? So what you've seen is incentives have gone up, right? So increase from 27% to 40%, right? Which means your net effective rent, the amount you're getting in your pocket as a landlord, has gone down. Vacancy rates, and you can see that, kind of your actually St. Kilda Road's kind of hit with a higher vacancy rate than most anywhere else of late. So vacancies have gone up a little bit more. And then your rents, so there's your average rents, right? You're kind of 300 to 500. What rents you get will depend very much on the grade of your building and the location of it, right? And the amenities, right? So there's so many factors that go into it. But, if you look at that, I said 446 a square meter, for your prime, or 736 for prime, and A grade 446. Next slide, please. Retail, the winner of, next slide. The winner in retail, go to the next one as well, is neighborhood. Neighborhood shopping centers did great out of COVID because, man, you were restricted to 5K. You guys were 3K here, right? $10,000 fines or craziness, which they gave to some college student or something, I don't know. Neighborhood shopping centers have gone very, very well. Discretionary spend versus non-discretionary spend is what you need to think about, right? So I need to go and shop and buy medicine at a chemist. I need to go to a bottle shop because I can't get through the day without it. I need to buy groceries, right? So those kind of non-discretionary type of things fared very well. During COVID, discretionary took a big hit. The post-COVID holiday splash out, non-discretionary has been going really, really well. So shopping centers are kind of broken down into size categories. If you think, again, properties is easy. It's not rocket science. It's all about categories, right? So you kind of have regional and then sub-regional neighborhood, right? There are different types and sizes of centers. And you can look at kind of where they're going from a square meter perspective and from a yield perspective as well. Go to the next one. Next one. Industrial, I kind of covered this earlier. You can go to the next, like I spoke a lot about industrial where we had the cap rates had compressed from like the 7s to the 3s. They as an asset class are going to go back up. Alternative real estate snapshot, so almost there. I love the alternative space because it's just a little bit different. You're playing higher on the risk curve than you do when you're playing in kind of your standard, bog standard office and whatnot. Retirement. Retirement is fascinating, and I'm actually really deep in retirement, so it's all I could do to only put one bullet here, and I won't talk about it because I could talk to you for 6 hours on retirement. But the fact of the matter is, and maybe some of you experience this, when you're in 5-kilometer lockdowns, if your mom or your dad is in a retirement facility 10K away, all of a sudden you couldn't bring them anything. You couldn't do anything. You were like, wow. That village manager, if they were good, they became a surrogate son or daughter. And word of mouth is one of the best ways that retirement villages fill. And right now, there's very few retirement villages that have any places available. They got a massive shot in the arm through COVID because people said, this is great. Isolation, it solved the isolation issue for a lot of the oldies. And the children were like, wow, my parents were taken care of well. They can't build them fast enough right now. Aged care, different story, right? You've seen the Royal Commission, you've seen all kinds of things that have come out, and most of the aged care providers are actually losing money. Fascinating and difficult, challenging sector to be in right now. Hotels and pubs, there's been a renewed interest because who doesn't want to go and grab a drink? Domestic view, so domestic tourism got a big hit as well through COVID, although I would say that's now starting to wane as now people are like, okay, I am going to go overseas again. But pubs there was a lot of domestic players that said, yep, I'm going to start hoovering up some pubs, and some great big deals have been done there. Agriculture, right? Australia's a land on agriculture. Yeah, flying in today, I felt like I was flying into the Mekong Delta, right? It's so green. Melbourne, like it's normally brown, right? But it was absolutely, green. Crop yields have increased, although now we're getting almost too much rain in some instances, so crops are getting affected by that as well. But on a whole, as an Australian agricultural sector, it's been a good year for that. And you've seen prices go up in those. And then food security, right? So massive impact, right, with the war in Ukraine. Ukraine was the breadbasket, not for us, but for mostly North Africa. And so there is a massive grain shortage that is happening there. Australia will be able to step up and supply that. And herein lies some of the other issues of, right, it's all interconnected. Then grain growers go, well, I could sell my grain for more money if I sell it over there than domestically. So then domestic prices go up, right? And you're just like, well, why? So
Gas debate, isn't it?
absolutely, absolutely. And build to rent. So build to rent, we call this everywhere else in the world multifamily. And it simply means a building that is purpose-built for you to live in it as apartments, as opposed to just sold as a strata off the plan. A lot of interest in this space, and also kind of this bleeds into social housing, and a lot of interest in that space right now. There are some structural issues that are preventing it from exploding, like in other countries where there's trillions of dollars of build to rent. And that includes taxation hurdles and things of that nature. So that is my last slide, and I think I'm relatively close to time, probably 1 minute before, but I've quashed lots of question time. So are there any questions? There's probably lots of questions, but
Just on the, particularly at the office, I guess, but it could be broader by implication. There's a lot of talk right now in the industrial relations space around changes, particularly around the flexible working for workers. Talk about COVID and the pre-COVID, post-COVID, people pushing back. How do you see that legislation potentially solidifying, I guess, some of those boundaries that we're now at from a flexibility?
it's really interesting, and it's so fraught with litigiousness, right? When you start putting in regulations that say you have to do this or you have to do this, because you have to put your head on as a, and you guys would actually be much more into this than people in large corporates, right? My risk as a business owner, if I mandate someone to come back to my office, if they catch COVID, am I then liable? And can I prove that they caught it on the train coming into the office because I told them they had to? Or did they get it in the grocery store the night before? Really difficult from a timing perspective and allocation of risk. Now, we're not a crazy litigious country as much as the US is, but it raises a flurry of issues around that kind of legislation. So I actually personally see it as staying gummed up for a while, because I don't think there's an easy way.
Particularly in the unionised sort of industry, though. So.
Absolutely. And it's one thing to say work from home, right? That's through the lens of a knowledge worker, right? If you're a bus driver, you can't work from home. If you're a burger flipper, you can't do them from home, right? If you're building a building, you can't do that from home. So in a lot of organizations, there's actually a lot of reticence to use these new ways of working, because there's an us and them mentality, right? When you have a meeting and all your steel workers are in there and they're going, well, the management was able to work from their living rooms, but I'm out there welding rivets, right? It causes additional friction. Yeah. Well,
All right, well done,
that's
mate.
it. No worries.